Okay, in this video we're looking at expanding spinal flexion range of motion, particularly in the lumbar spine. Now, oftentimes people are afraid to kind of train this range of motion because of our understanding of posture and what proper posture is. So oftentimes we'll see people demonstrating a very overly flexed thoracic spine, a very anteriorly tilted pelvis. But a lot of times this flexion at the thoracic spine is stemming from a lumbar spine that struggles to flex. And we're stuck in this anterior pelvic tilt with the hips pushed forward. And in order for the eyes to stay on the horizon, the thoracic spine has to flex to keep the gaze forward, or else if the entire thoracic spine and cervical spine followed the lumbar spine, we'd be stuck here all the time. I like to get people to develop more spinal flexion first, especially when you have a spine that has difficulty with rotation, has difficulty with extension and flexion. So spinal flexion will help gap the facet joints in the spine, which will improve space within the joint capsules to allow more range of motion elsewhere through rotation and extension. People with this anterior tilt style posture struggle to extend the spine as well because they're already stuck there. So if we get them to posteriorly tilt the pelvis much better, achieve some length through the spinal erectors, the lumbar spine erectors, the QLs, then we'll have more space to extend and rotate from. Now, when it comes to rotation, you can try this. If you flex forward and then rotate through the thoracic spine, you'll notice you have much more space to do so. Whereas if you're already maxed out in extension, it's very tough to rotate because there's compression of the spinal facet joints, so you don't have space for those joints to rotate. So how do you know if you're limited in spinal flexion? So typically we'll look at the standing forward fold. People who have a restriction in lumbar flexion, their forward fold will look like this. So they tend to overly use hip flexion and tilting the pelvis forward to achieve their global flexion here. So we want to see a nice uniform curve of the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, and then that will eventually allow the pelvis to tilt forward. Now, somebody who doesn't have a lot of hip flexion range of motion, you'll tend to see this, where the hip struggles to move backwards in space, the femur struggles to glide posterior in the socket, and they're stuck here. People with very stiff and guarded lumbar erectors will typically have a hard time unlocking that lumbar spine when they're flexing. Now, oftentimes we'll see the inability to posteriorly tilt the pelvis result in anterior hip pain, especially with femoral acetabular impingement, because when the pelvis is stuck in anterior tilt, then you don't have much space to flex and internally rotate the hip. Posterior pelvic tilt will reduce coverage of the acetabular rim over the femoral head and allow more space to internally rotate and flex. So that's why developing more spinal flexion will help with the overall space for your hip to move through both flexion and rotation. And a lot of times these lumbar spine muscles are quite guarded because they're weak at their end range. So I'm going to show you some of my go-to drills to lengthen the lumbar spine erectors under load. In this first drill, we're going to utilize femoral external rotation and flexion to help facilitate more of a posterior pelvic tilt and dropping on the same side that we're stretching, so that we can achieve more length through the spinal erectors and the quadratus lumborum on that side. So let me explain. When we externally rotate the femur, when we run out of space for pure femoral rotation, what ends up happening is the pelvis will drop on that side, and then we start to get more length through the side of the trunk here. So we can utilize that to help facilitate more tucking under of the pelvis to achieve more lumbar flexion. So you can even try this standing. If you externally rotate, it ends up tucking the pelvis under and pushing the pelvis forward. So I'll demo here, stretching my left side. We're going to have some sort of support for the hands so that we can push the rib cage back. So I'm going to bring my femur into flexion, and then I'm going to abduct and externally rotate as much as I can. And then what I could do here is go onto the outside edge of my foot, sit back, push the rib cage back into space, and then side bend away from it. And I should feel a nice stretch through the low back on this side. You can play with where this foot is. You may feel a stretch if it's more out here and abducted. You may want to bring it in and then pull the foot out and rotate away. Yes, you'll feel a little bit of a stretch through the hip, but we're not anteriorly tilting the pelvis, so that means we're not fully lengthening the hip rotators here. Okay, I'm going to get into external rotation, pull the knee outwards, push the rib cage back, and then rotate away. And then the more I round my spine toward the ground, the more length I feel through the QLs, lumbar spine, extensors back there. So we can contract and relax in this position. I can passively push this knee down even more, and then I can drive that knee up into my hand. Inhale, exhale, and then flex further. Push about 5 to 10 seconds. Round the spine, flex further. You could rotate further away. And I'm getting a huge stretch here through the lumbar spine. If I show you from the front here, externally rotate, round toward the ground, a little passive overpressure here, contract, relax, using external rotation to guide more posterior pelvic tilt and lumbar flexion. Moving on to this deep squat lumbar flexion strategy. Now this is one of my favorite drills to do frequently. In fact, I use this one every time I walk into the gym. I use it in my warm-up to help decrease some tone in the lumbar extensors. Now I do appreciate when it comes to utilizing a deep squat position, it does require knees that don't have any current orthopedic injuries. But that being said, if you can achieve full compression in the knee, this is a very useful strategy and again, one of my favorites. When we're doing this squat, we want to have as narrow of a stance as possible because this is going to help us take up the slack in hip flexion earlier to allow for the pelvis to tuck under. Okay, if we use like our normal wide, externally rotated squat stance, then we're not going to deviate into as much posterior pelvic tilt as early as we want. Okay, so we're going to keep the stance fairly close together, and then we're going to step back about a foot away from the rack just so we can have our arms more straight. Okay, so I'm going to loop my hands around the rack. Okay, I'm going to get my toes just below my knees. Now from here, I'm going to shift my rib cage backwards in space. Okay, this is a rib cage retraction as I'm pulling the hands forward so the scapulas are protracted. Now from here, I'm going to pull my knees forward, and this drags the pelvis underneath even more. And now we should feel a good stretch through the lumbar spine on both sides. Now, if we want to make this more intense and bias one side, we can now bring one knee forward, one knee back. So I'm bringing my right knee even more forward, and I'm slightly rotating toward the left here as my left knee comes backwards. And then, of course, if dorsiflexion is a limiter, come off the heel of the side that's moving forward. So now I feel a very strong stretch through the back here. Stay in this position, breathe, inhale. Inhale through the nose. Exhale. As I exhale, pull the knee further. Again. Inhale. Exhale. Just use the breath to move a bit deeper. Okay, you could do about 3 to 5 breath cycles and then switch sides. What I'll typically do is kind of move dynamically through and get a nice mobilization on each side. And then after about 5 to 10 reps or so, I'll stay on my tighter side and just do some breathing in that position. Common mistakes here are starting too close, because now we don't have space to retract the rib cage, and when we do that, torso ends up being at an angle backwards instead of being straight upright. Okay, so we want to be far enough away that allows for the torso to stay upright as we retract the ribs and bring the knees forward. Okay, this last drill is a segmented spinal flexion. Now we can actually start to get some eccentric lengthening under load through these lumbar extensors. So I'm going to start with a slight knee bend, and for this first variation, we're just going to understand segmental flexion off the wall. So I'm going to take the roller and I'm going to apply pressure with my hands down, so we're getting some abdominal contraction here. Okay, now from here I'm going to start with my chin tucked, then my upper back, then my lower back starts to round, mid back and low back, and I'm going to keep the pelvis and the very lower part of the lumbar spine on the wall the entire time. Once I max out that range, I'm going to inhale, exhale, and then slowly segment back up the wall one vertebrae at a time. Okay, so again, neck, upper back, mid back, low back, as if I'm peeling Velcro slowly off a wall. Inhale, exhale. We don't want to turn this into a hinge. A lot of times people who struggle with segmentation, it's going to look like this. Okay, the low back completely comes off the wall, and it's just the upper part of the butt that's on the wall. Okay, so we want to maintain that posterior pelvic tilt the entire time. Once you understand this, we could start adding some load. Okay, so bring the feet underneath the knees a bit more, posterior tilt. And then we could start to round. And we're not moving at the hip here, okay? Just the spine. So we're not utilizing any sort of hip hinge strategy. Think of this as like a loaded cat-camel from standing. Now again, if we want to bias one side, we can do this in a kickstand. But again, we're not using a hip hinge strategy here. It's all lumbar flexion. My hand is hardly coming past the kneecap, because if I go any further, it's coming from my hip. Okay, start very light with this one at first. Okay, a lot of people are very used to using the glutes and the hamstrings to help produce force out of a hinge. So we really want to condition the lumbar spine muscles in this drill to take the majority of the loading. So give this a try. Light to moderate weight, 10 to 12 very slow repetitions. Okay, so those are some ideas to improve lumbar spine flexion and improve the ability for the pelvis to posterior tilt. Some key performance indicators to know if this was useful for you is retest your squat, see if it feels more comfortable in the bottom position. I know just from demoing those drills, my squat feels really nice, no pinch in the hip whatsoever, because now I have more space to flex the hip. And then you can also retest your forward fold. And you should notice much more space to round forward and utilize the lumbar spine to globally flex. And then you might even find you have more space to then flex the hip as well and achieve more length through the hamstring, because you're not stuck in this anterior tilt anymore and you don't have any more space to further flex the pelvis forward even more. Give those drills a try. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed them. As always, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone with a stiff low back.